Welcome to Supernatural Circumstances, the podcast where we take you down the rabbit hole into the fantastic world of the strange, the paranormal, and the unknown. I'm Morgan Knudsen.
And I'm Mike Browne. It's time to dim the lights and settle in. Come along with us on this week's adventure. And we're off to the Badger State, Wisconsin this time, speaking with our friend Jeff Finup.
Yeah, and for those who are cryptid fans and legend hunters, kind of like we are, Jeff is known online as the legend hunter, the Badgerlands Legends, and he's phenomenal. He's been all over the place. He's been documenting really interesting and cool stories from Wisconsin and from, well, all sorts of places all over America for a really, really long time. And he has come up with this amazing book, which is a lot of fun, Wisconsin Legends for Kids. And it's cool because it really starts to bridge a bit of a gap that I think has been unaddressed.
Yeah, it definitely does. Have you read his book? Because I didn't get a chance.
It's really cool. And he's got stories in there that I didn't even know about. Tales from that area. I mean, I consider myself somewhat well-versed in tales from that area because I really enjoy it. And there was stuff in there that I had no idea about, which was really interesting. And he made it so accessible for every age group. And this is one of those fields, I think, or have always thought that really it should be introduced at an early age to kids to get their interest up in the world.
Yeah,
and he managed to do it. Yeah, exactly.
I'm curious, does he mention the hodag in his book?
Of course he mentions the hodag.
So for anybody who doesn't know what that is, it's HODAG. Google it, and you can read more about it in his book. But let's just go have a conversation with Jeff.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Yeah. Oh, the hodag is scary looking. Holy crap.
He's a little creepy. Well, Jeff, it is so good to have you here on Supernatural Circumstances because this is a topic that Mike and I, we've kind of touched on, but it's something that I've wanted to do for a little while because this is something that has come up over and over and over again in all my years of history and research, which is kids and this subject matter. How do we broach it? What do we do? And you kind of wrote the book about it, which is awesome. So first of all, welcome to the show. It is really, really good to have you finally.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be on Supernatural Circumstances and talk about this conversation.
I think it's a really important one because, and I'll preface this a little bit for the listeners and the fact that for years and years, when I would either go to investigate or research a case or because for a long time I was dealing with private clients and things like that. And many times we would get emails from kids and things like that or parents that were saying either A, my parents don't know how to talk to me about this, I don't know what to do, or the parents going, I've got children, I don't know where I'm supposed to go with this with my kids. So this I think is really interesting that you wrote a book with the inspiration of your amazing daughter to introduce kids into this subject matter. Do you want to talk a little bit about the book and how that came about for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the name of the book is Wisconsin Legends for Kids. So at the time I'd been writing for Badgerland Legends, my Instagram and Facebook presence, just kind of chronicling the different stories from Wisconsin about, the bizarre and some of the supernatural aspects. And my daughter, on her walks to school, she was 6 at the time, and going into first grade, we would talk about, the different legends from around the area, what may have happened historically, and then some of the more bizarre or unexplained occurrences. So every day on the way to school, she'd ask me to tell her a story. So I would tell her, a story about the pancakes from outer space, or this flood of frogs that came in one year on the lake shores of Lake Michigan near Green Bay, or a worm shower. And she was just very intrigued by it. And then eventually she asked me one day, well, Dad, why don't you write this in a book? And she had hounded me probably for a month or two straight, saying, Dad, when are you going to write that book? When are you going to write that book? So I finally had to put pen to paper and sift through some of the scarier stories from Wisconsin to actually pick out maybe some of the more family or kid friendly. So I think I hit the sweet spot, making them, something that is full of wonderment, intrigue, but not too scary, just to kind of get kids to dip their toes into some of these supernatural tales, especially from places around her.
There were a lot more books like this when I was a kid. This is what it was, books like yours that sort of triggered me into wanting to learn more about these things. And you mentioned actually one of my absolute favorite Wisconsin stories, Joe Simonton and his pancakes. We've talked about it a bit before here on the show, but can you go into that just a little bit? I don't mean to distract us from this, but it is
No,
a really fun story.
Oh, we have to touch on them.
Yeah.
absolutely. And, the pancakes from outer space is the title I gave to this story. And it started on April 18th of 1961. It's a sleepy Northwoods town. It's called Eagle River, Wisconsin, just north of Rhinelander, the home of the Hodag. And shortly before noon, a saucer-shaped craft hovered just above the ground on Joe Simonton's property. Now, Joe Simonton in the lore, he's been called a chicken farmer, but he was actually a professional plumber. So he had a real property with chickens on it, and that may be where that's conflated. So after landing nearby, an occupant peeked his head out of the craft's hatch, and the occupant motioned to Simonton by holding up a jug, which looked like a water jug, to the plumber. Now, he thought this was a signal that the occupant wanted him to fill it with water. So after Joe retrieved the jug, filled it with water, he returned it to the ship. A different occupant on the inside was making what looked like cakes or flapjacks on an open griddle. So Simonton kind of gestured to him and they handed him 4 cakes. Now, the cakes, they were about um, a quarter-inch thick and about 3 or 4 inches in diameter. And there's actually pictures and people that collected these from him and took them in for testing. So it really begs the question, did Simonton just receive pancakes from outer space? And that has to be one of my favorite subjects in all of UFO and Wisconsin lore, just because it touches on so many different aspects. We have a trace evidence encounter. We have what almost seems like a fairy folk encounter, and then it's also tied in with the UFO or alien lore. So it's a fun story. I'm glad I could put it in the book. I'm glad I could introduce it in to my daughter, and of course share it with the broader public.
Yeah.
Oh, you've got some great stories in here. And I mean, I consider myself pretty familiar with Wisconsin, and there's some in here that I have not heard. And one of them being about mini mastodons. Yeah,
Ah, the mini
please talk
mastodons,
about that a
yes.
little bit because I have not heard this one.
We all know that large elephant-like creatures called mastodons, they roam the forests and the prairies of prehistoric North America, and definitely in Wisconsin. Scientists believe that the last of the mastodons, they died off about 11,000 years ago,
Mm.
kind of towards the end of that ice age. It's said that there was due to lack of food and other things, but some say that a group of mini mastodons survived until recently. Now, there was, of course, that lack of food, which generation over generation made the mastodon shrink. As time passed, the new mastodons, or this kind of smaller miniaturized mastodon, they hardly resembled their ancestors. Now, they had free run of all of the forests and the canyons of Wisconsin's driftless area during this time. Um, because of their smaller stature and the sparse population, they were able to survive. With fewer mates, of course, the species eventually dwindled. Now, it's said that some people even took these in as pets and had mastodons as pets. Now, the story, it sounds like folklore, but it may be informed by a true story. Now, in 1897, in the town of Boaz, Wisconsin, which is in Wisconsin's Driftless region, the Driftless being a section of Wisconsin that was undisturbed or undisrupted by the glaciers. Now, when most people think of Wisconsin, they think of America's Dairyland, they think of the rolling hills or maybe the forests of the Northwoods, but there is a certain section called the Driftless region. It is the southwest section of the state, and it's been untouched. So there are plenty of limestone outcroppings. There are river valleys. There's gorges. It just does not resemble what you would think of the stereotypical Wisconsin. So amongst that, they found this mastodon skeleton almost in full, and it has been appropriated by the University of Wisconsin, their Science and History Museum, and you can actually see it on display there. And
Wow.
it's kind of ties the story of the mini mastodons to the actual mastodons that roam the land of Wisconsin in prehistory.
That is just the coolest thing. And
That's
it
really
also,
cool. Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah. And it tickles my dinosaur bone because as a
Oh
kid,
boy.
right? I loved dinosaurs when I was a kid. I loved it.
Absolutely, yeah, me too.
Love them.
Definitely. Dug up the garden looking
Mm-hmm.
for bones. I found one. My dad said, "That's pot roast bone. We threw that out a few weeks ago."
Hey, close enough, and shame on your dad for busting your
Yeah,
bubble.
exactly. He could have played into it a little bit better.
But I love this compilation and how you laid it out with the stories that you picked, because I think that's the one thing that we've lost a little bit in the way these stories are told today. We've
Mhm.
got such a bent on terror and fear, and if it's not terrifying, then it's not going to sell. And what I really love about what you've done with this is that you've really been able to these break down these stories and find the ones that, like Mike and I have said, captured our imaginations. You know, when
Mhm.
we were kids, they're not something that it does. This stuff doesn't have to be frightening and terrifying. You really found this amazing sweet spot, like you were saying, of just you want to know more. And the great thing about this is that a lot of these legends, like you were saying, have very much tangible history that you can
Mhm.
go out and touch, which I think is really, really special.
Yeah, and even if you can't touch it as it remains today, you can actually put yourself in the place and kind
Yeah.
of transport yourself back into that world and say, what was this like 150 years ago? What did people do when they came to Wisconsin? Wisconsin's not that old of a state. It's only about 175 years old. So it's not too hard to think, okay, these people were a lot like us. They had a lot of the same language, some of the same traditions as us. And how did they experience it? And it's great that Wisconsin has a resource called Old World Wisconsin, where you
Mm-hmm.
can actually kind of step into the past. They have well preserved period houses and people in period dress going through their day to day lives, where you can go in and talk to them and say, what happened here at this time? Or what was life like that? And I figured this, you know, introducing kind of a more spiritual or supernatural bent actually kind of helps transmit that history in a different vehicle. And I really enjoyed that.
Well, those are the stories that I always remembered as kids.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I
Me
might
too.
have,
Yeah.
yeah, like I might have snored through history class on said on some days, right? But those are the stories that I mean, when I was younger, that stood out for me. They're what made me remember these things. What do you think the pitfalls are that parents seem to be hitting with some of with conveying some of this information to people, especially their kids?
I think it's really easy to scare kids. And I remember
Mm.
my mom bringing home a spooky book from the library. It was definitely wasn't geared towards kids. It was more a compilation of lore. It was actually called Wisconsin Lore. And it was by two professors that they went around the state in the early 70s and collected a bunch of, old folk ways, folk beliefs, folklore, and even had a section there on ghost stories. So if you see on the first page of the book, I put Wisconsin contains, if the yarns are an indication, more ghosts per square mile than any other state in the nation. Now, I remember reading that as an 8-year-old and thinking, oh my, there are a lot of ghosts around here. I wonder if
Right.
there's one in my neighborhood. So it really kind of created a sense of wonder for me. So I had to really, where that started for me, I had to start the book with that. And then, of course, kind of laid out the rest of the book in similar fashion to um, really present it to my daughter and eventually her little brother, who's a couple years behind her, with this information about, the place that she lives in could be enchanted. She could live in an enchanted realm. And just by using a little of her imagination, reading up on history, talking to people about these legends, she can kind of um, partake or enjoy that the same way as I did as a kid. So that was really the driving force behind it.
Yeah, I mean, and it comes off in the book as well. Like there's such a personal touch with this, which is great because it really feels like with each story you can hear somebody telling the story. And I think that's something that's really important and something that's kind of been missing as we've moved along in the media with that the idea of magic. Now we've got people who are just they've just kind of shut that out. No, no, no. You're not being realistic. You're being silly. Grow up. And I
Mm.
love what you're saying with this, where it's like, no, wait a minute. There is a level of magic. It might not be Harry Potter magic, but there is a world out there that we exist in that has these non-physical components that is unexplainable in a lot of ways. And I think that's really, really significant within each story is getting these kids to understand that we have this non-physical presence in the world. How did your daughter take to this?
She absolutely loved it. As soon as I printed out the book, I gave her the proof copy. She tore through it. She's 8 now. She is a very voracious reader. She's
Awesome.
reading at like a fifth or sixth grade level, which is awesome. So for her to grab it, read it, and then ask me questions about it, just that really made it worth it for me in the end to say, "Wow, did this really happen?" Or "What do you think? What happened to this strange lion that roamed Wood County, Wisconsin in the 1950s?" Or "Tell me more about Wisconsin's Dogman." Or "Dad, can we go to Chicken Alley or to the Burlington Vortex and check that out?" So it kind of helped grow our relationship and then also give us ideas of things that we can experience as a family and kind of create memories from her childhood to say, "Hey, Dad, remember when we went and did this or we looked for this?" And, I thought that was a really um, kind of fringe benefit to putting something like this together.
This just reminds me of discussions I had with my dad when I was a kid. My dad wasn't a writer like you are, but he was interested in things, and he had a book on Oak Island back in the day, and I grew up just 20 minutes away from there.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
So I was that was kind of my first foray into this kind of thing was with my dad having a discussion about the book that he was reading about Oak Island. And, he took us there as kids. We went there. It was, and those are memories that your daughter is going to have forever. And hopefully, other parents in Wisconsin and from other places will read your book and be able to take their kids and do some really great things that will make indelible memories for them that are so meaningful and fun.
Yeah, and I really hope that that is the case, and I think from early counts that definitely is. So, I had a kind of a similar upbringing. My mom, she definitely believed in ghosts. She believed in angels and stuff like that. My dad, he's a little more skeptical, but he's had a couple unexplained encounters that he's kind of puzzled with in kind of his advanced age. So it's fun being able to keep it kind of a family affair and have family legends and family stories. So just anything I can do to do that, and if people take the book and they have their own adventures and create that memory, that's all the better.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Coming from somebody whose great-great-grandfather did write 2 books on this subject matter,
Yeah.
um, this was this was something that was really magical for me to discover, like, speaking as a grown adult for the most part, and looking back on my great-great-grandfather's books, I didn't learn about those until I was an adult. I was well into my parapsychology career, and it was something that never was passed down to me in the family at all. And we kind of stumbled onto who he was over the course of the time that I've been researching, and I'm telling you, the importance of those books and being able to read about who he was, what he did, what his position was, and to pass down that knowledge was so, so, so important. And it kind of, I guess, brings me to my next question a little bit, where uh, here you've created this incredible opportunity, like, with your daughter. What is it that parents can do, or maybe shouldn't be doing, when they're passing this information on to their kids? Because oftentimes we pass on how we think and we pass on our biases. So do you
Hmm.
want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think just presenting them with the history and then kind of a little bit of lore to sprinkle
Mm-hmm.
in, and just kind of seeing them run with it seems to have been my best strategy. Because I think if you try to spoon feed it to them or you try to force it on them, they might just reject it out of whole cloth just to kind of be rebellious or say, well, that's not really my thing. But to take them to someplace and say, did you hear there might be a lake monster here? And then be
Hmm.
able to give them maybe a little bit of a fright, but not too much, and then be able to tell them a little about the history and instill that sense of wonderment in a place that they live.
Yeah, I love just the idea of instilling wonderment, like you were saying, because I think that's something that I've found, at least with interacting with generations now that are ahead of me, that is missing. There's something that's missing, and I don't know whether it's because kids are all glued to their screens. I don't know whether it's just how they're being raised now or whichever, but more and more seem to be losing that. And they don't start that way, because I think when we're kids, we have that sense of adventure, and it's there. But there's something that seems to be quelling that to some degree. And you ask a lot of kids that age nowadays, and they're just like, no, I don't believe in any of that stuff. So I love this idea of being constructive with it, but also the fact that I think what you're doing is fostering an understanding and an empathy. And I'll just touch briefly on, you cover the Beast of Bray Road in
Hmm.
your book, which is one of my absolute
Yeah.
favorites tales, because I've been involved with dogman research here in Alberta for a very long time, and that's the one thing that I've noticed that has been so horribly missing in a lot of this stuff. Everybody is so focused on the fear and being frightened that they've forgotten about the empathy side of this. And that I mean, I've had amazing, wonderful experiences with Dogman. It's incredible, and I love that about what you're doing. So can we talk a little bit about that, and how this actually, I think, does foster, like, empathy and critical thought? It's really important.
Yeah, it is. And then, like you said, everything, I'll call it the ghost adventurization of everything, and
Uh-huh.
the
Oh
thrill.
boy.
Yeah, the the thrilling aspect, and I do love that part of it. So I'm not going to fade it too much, because I think there is something
Hmm.
um, about getting in a visceral, primal position. I think that's why a lot of people do this, is to get a good scare. Why we go to haunted houses, why we ride roller coasters, why we speed down a dirt road.
Yeah.
there's many reasons why we do that. So I think that is, part of the human experience. But to kind of play that empathy into it and kind of transport ourselves into the mind frame of somebody who, would have encountered something like this, would have experienced something like this, or, kind of encountering that other and saying, what does this other want from me, or what is the experience that I'm having? I think there's some deeper personal questions, philosophical questions that we each have to answer for ourselves. And I think that's uh, part of the reason why a lot of people are engaged in this field, to know that, there's more than, the four dimensions that we live in, and the five senses that we experience, that there might be something right on the edge, and how we can kind of encounter that, do it, safely and respectfully, especially something like ghost hunting. Not necessarily taunting the spirits, but respecting that somebody else lived here before us. Somebody had stewardship of a land or a house, and how to kind of move that into the future, saying, um, one person I follow on Instagram, his name's Doug Duran. He says it's not my land, it's my turn, which pretty much says, like, I am this steward of this property
Hmm.
for the time being. He owns a farm in
That's nice.
kind
Yeah.
of in Richland County, where those mini mastodons were found. So it's interesting to kind of bring the human element, and kind of the spirit of humanity into spaces and the subject that I really enjoy.
At the risk of sounding too alliterative here, I just keep thinking when somebody's trying to scare me with a story, I'm just like, well, where's the whimsy? Come on, that's what I
Hmm.
really love is the whimsical stories. I don't need to be frightened all the time. Let's have some whimsy too.
Whimsy and wonder, and some of, like, my favorite cinema of this genre is
Hmm.
not the direct creature feature where you see the either the killer or the creature in all its glory, but you can see the visage of it, like the original Cloverfield,
Hmm.
and It Follows. Two of my favorites, because
Yep.
you actually don't see the beast. Your imagination kind of fills in the blank spaces, rather than just the gore, the grotesquerie, or just the explicit nature of it.
Yeah, to me, that's way scarier. Is what goes on in my mind. Don't show me the whole
Uh,
thing. I want to be able to come up with it on my own because it's way
exactly.
scarier in there.
Yeah. In, like, the classic M. Night Shyamalan Signs, um,
Hmm.
where it was actually scarier before you saw the alien.
Right.
And when you saw the alien, it was almost like, yeah,
Oh.
that's scary, but it was also a sense of relief that you knew what you were dealing with. But
Hmm.
before then, it was kind of a supernatural occurrence.
Oh, I love the one thing you touched on there, which is that exploration for kids of the unknown. And I think the one thing that really intrigues me about all of this, and the one thing that I hope that people can take away from this when they're interacting with their kids, is exploring the unknown and being okay with not knowing. There's so much in the world right now where I think everybody has to put a label on everything, and we kind of have this idea that, well, if science hasn't explained it, well, then that's it. And that's just simply not true. And I mean, we all know that as researchers, but the idea of being able to, like, be comfortable with the unknown and see it as something, like Mike, you were saying, as whimsical and magical rather than something to be terrified of. I think that's got a broader implications than just this particular subject matter. Like, I think getting into this and studying in this field, whether you're just interested as a kid or whether you decide to take it further, I think that in and of itself is a really important skill set to get early. Because I mean, just having that fear of the unknown as a kid, I mean, it can really take you into some pretty scary directions as an adult. I don't know what I'll leave it to you guys and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, and just kind of to start at the beginning of your statement, with trying to figure it all out. Like, you talked about loving dinosaurs as a kid. me, I can remember loving dinosaurs, and my next door neighbor, he introduced me to the Loch Ness Monster, and I had
Hmm.
not heard of it until he told me about it. And then, of course, we had to hatch a plan that we were going to capture the Loch Ness Monster someday, so we could get helicopters and a dragnet and some boats, and we'd get Nessie. But I think the more mature response is that, yeah, the mystery is part of the draw for that. Whether it's cryptozoology like Bigfoot or Nessie or ghost hunting, having the encounter and being left in the space without the answers does have, it has a lot of value to it.
Cases like you've got in the book, like you talk about the Burlington Vortex, which we'll have you talk about in a minute because it's really interesting.
Hmm.
I think this is setting up future researchers and getting kids into this really, really early I mean, it's got the potential to take anybody in any direction, whether it be further into science, further into nature, further into parapsychology. Doesn't matter. I mean, depending on whatever you're interested in. But I love the fact that this is actually setting up people. I mean, this, like myself, here I am, like decades later, still doing this. And I mean, I think that in and of itself is really, really important. I mean, it's passing down the information that we know now that, they get to now stand on your shoulders, stand on the shoulders of other researchers, and be able to make that next difference, even if it is with just sharing these stories again. But I'm going to let you talk a little bit about the Burlington Vortex because I think that's a really great example of how this branches into science. It branches into all sorts of questions.
Yeah, so the Burlington Vortex, Burlington, it's a southeastern Wisconsin town. It's not too far from Bray Road or Elkhorn, Wisconsin, where Bray Road lies. So Burlington's kind of the next town over, and it's known as Chocolate City, USA, because of a Nestle chocolate factory there. And um, the thing I like about both Burlington and Elkhorn is that they are any town USA. They're idyllic little Midwest town. Elkhorn specifically is known as the Christmas card town because of a campaign that started sometime, I believe, in the 40s or the 50s, where artists would come and they would draw the town square. So it has this little idyllic Midwest vibe, but just on the outskirts of town you have this kind of scarier element. And I think that juxtaposition, that kind of play between the light and the dark is really where the fun is at. So specifically in Burlington, there's said to be a small patch of forest just on the edge of town, and it's known as Burlington Woods. Now, the small forest is said to house a magnetic force known as the Burlington Vortex. This vortex creates changes to how we experience time and space. These disturbances, they've been captured in photographs as like swirling lights from a camera that's being held still, either at eye or shoulder level. Pictures taken in this woods, they've shown mysterious lights with streaks across the photographs. Now, visitors, they also report the area being filled with nymphs, sprites, fairies, and even mystical elves. So there is just something romantic about, having a small town, having kind of the idyllic Midwest town, and then having something kind of darker on the edge, and kind of being a fan of David Lynch, that kind of
Yeah.
strikes an interesting balance there between the two. So having this woods on the edge of town where strange and funny things, nothing malicious, nothing satanic, but just like Mike said, a sense of wonderment and whimsy.
Yeah, that was the thing that I've always tried to convey in any of my theater shows, my live shows, or anything like that. Because I always felt that the best way to get people to remember things, number one, is they have to be entertained, or else you're talking to a wall. But they also have to walk away feeling something.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of these cases really, really get to that, whether they're making you laugh, whether they're creeping you out a little bit, or whatever it is. I think that in and of itself is really, really, really important because that is what makes people connect to and remember this stuff. And I dealt with so many clients when I was still doing private cases and things like that, where they would come to me and say, I'm terrified of this stuff because my parents were terrified of this stuff. And because they were terrified, I had a terrible experience with it. And I've always thought, like, that conditioning, of course, never a good thing. Um, but what do you recommend to parents that are maybe in that spot, that they're sitting there going, like, I don't want to touch this stuff. My kid's into it, but I don't want to touch it because I'm freaked right out. What would you say to parents that are maybe struggling with their own biases in this department?
I would just encourage them to do more of their own research. Kind of figure out what the kid is interested, try to relate to it to them at the level they're at, find out what they're reading, and then also kind of do your own investigation. What is something that I can read that would be on this subject that um, might enlighten me to what their experience or what they're interested in. And I get it because my dad not interested in this stuff at all until more recently. Um, so he really couldn't relate. But if he had picked up a book on it or watched a TV show with me on it, or with me, um, I think that would have probably helped a lot. Just kind of taking that into consideration. I know just with the enormous amount of content on subjects like this, you don't really have to look far. Coming of age in the late '80s, early '90s, it was you had to catch the ghost episode of Unsolved Mysteries, or
Hmm.
you had to be in tune around Halloween. But this stuff is more accessible than ever, and putting out a book like this. Just want to make it as family friendly and approachable as possible, just so people could experience these things as a family. And it's kind of like a travel guide in itself. Definitely was inspired by Chad Lewis and his road guide to haunted places in Wisconsin. I've had the book for over 20 years, so just having stuff like that, being able to kind of encounter that, I think is great for families to kind of come together around subjects that might seem a little scary, but could actually, like we talked about earlier, really create memories.
Yeah, well, Mike, you had skeptical parents.
Hmm.
You
Yep.
had this conversation with your mom and dad. Like, maybe do you want to share a little bit about that? Like, how did you guys connect over this? I mean, I my parents were always very open about this stuff. Very, very interested. My grandmother, on the other hand, was absolutely anti anything to do with supernatural, because she was very sensitive. She was a medium, and had her her energy around this wasn't good, so she was attracting terrible experiences. And she thought that that was it. That was the way this was. That if
Mm.
you delved into this, this was horrible, and you were going to have a horrible experience. And I mean, she had all the old biases about it and whatever. And thankfully, like, my mom and dad did not carry those with them. They kind of broke that cycle, which was really, really good. And always captured my imagination with this stuff when it came to, some of the shows that were on at the time, like sightings and things like that. But you didn't have that. You had a different relationship with this stuff.
Mom didn't really talk about this stuff. It was more stuff that Dad and I talked about. And Dad, he was a veterinarian, so he was very empirical and science based and all that kind of stuff. But he was open to explore. He was just one of those guys who was open to explore the question. He didn't say whether or not it was real, or he was not sort of, he didn't come down on one side or the other. And that's what brought me to sort of be the person that I am, is because my dad was just like, well, we don't know for sure, so let's explore this. um, I have other things that have gone on since we talked about yesterday, and we've talked about in other episodes, um, where my dad has just recently passed away, and it was moments before his death. He and I had a conversation, like literal moments before his death, had a conversation about if you can, you know, give me some sign from beyond, kind of thing. And he kind of, smirked a little bit, but he said, yeah, if I can, I will. Absolutely. And so, after he passed away, about 30 minutes after or so, I'm sitting in a room, and I had brought the chair that we'd been sitting in around his bed as he was passing, and brought it into this room with me. And I sat it down, and I was sitting there just to have a moment to myself, and I was thinking about Dad. And the chair moved, just this little boomp, just this little boomp. And I thought, oh, there he is. Like, I don't know whether or not that was actually Dad, or what happened, or why the chair moved, or what, it could have been any number of things. But to me, in that moment, it was like, well, he said, that he was, there's nothing around that would have moved that chair. So I'm wondering if it was him. That night, I go out with some friends, and we're having a discussion. And in another room, there's a stack of chairs, and that stack of chairs falls over while I'm talking about my dad. So, so 2 instances on the day that my dad passed away, after I'd asked him about, give me a sign from the other side kind of thing. 2 instances with chairs, moving on their own. Okay. Like, I don't know what it was. But I can interpret it any number of ways. But he was the type of guy who would say to me, well, it's either one thing or the other, or something in between. So let's investigate this.
I
We
love
may
that.
never know.
Thanks for sharing that.
Isn't that the coolest thing? I think it's the coolest thing.
Well, it freaked the hell out of me at the time. It was not something that I was just like, I didn't expect it to happen.
But those are the best things. And I really think sometimes that's when if these things do happen. Number one is when things are least expected.
Well, especially the individual that it happened around, like that he was such an empirical guy.
Mm-hmm.
Show me the evidence. But I'm not going to say one way or the other. I want to see the evidence.
Well, that's the magic of I think what we're talking about here. And one of the really powerful things about connecting kids with this information early is that when stuff happens in our life that is unexplainable, or things that we can't explain, or maybe don't know how to get in touch with. I think that's one of the reasons, Jeff, why your books like this are so important, because it really allows kids to garner some of these tools at an age that maybe, our generation didn't have.
Yeah. And, coming up, in the late 80s, early 90s, like a lot of this stuff just wasn't accessible.
Yeah.
I know Mike said, there's a lot of books, but those seem to come out later, like the Goosebumps and the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, I believe was the name of one of them.
Mm-hmm.
I wish those would have came out a little bit earlier for me, but I think a lot of this stuff is accessible now, and to kind of add to that collection, specifically with my state, there was nothing else for it. So definitely was an opening in the market, and people seem to enjoy it. So I'm pleased.
I had a really cool experience happen to me. This was last year. I was speaking at Stampede Park in Calgary, and I was doing a show on the true story behind Ghostbusters and parapsychology behind Ghostbusters. So it attracted a really broad range of people that were, of course, grew up with the movies, and then of course the kids that were seeing the new movie that had just come out. And so there was a pretty broad range in the crowd and whatever, and getting lots of questions. I always have question period at the end. We have people lined up at the microphones, and this dad and his young daughter, who looked, I would say, probably about your daughter's age, Jeff, probably around 8. And she came up, and she was really shy. She was so sweet. And her dad had said he was going to ask her question because she was too nervous. And he said, she wants to know, how do I know when these things are around? And she was asking not from a place of fear, but like, I'm not sure whether maybe she had lost somebody recently, but she genuinely had this question. You could see it in her face. And it was such a great opportunity to connect with her. And I told her, and then addressed kind of the rest of the kids in the audience. And I said, this stuff is around you all the time. And that this is something that you get to tune into. And the more you look into this, the more you find that stillness within yourself, the more joy you find, the more all of these things, the more you automatically begin to connect in to the magic that's already there. And I like it was such a great experience to be able to sort of see her light up at this idea, and she's gonna go home and do exactly what we do, you know. And it was really cool. So what type of feedback, or if any, have you gotten so far from the book being out?
Since I published it, I've actually had quite a few people reach out with their own stories, whether, it was an
Cool.
encounter, seeing lights or seeing something unexplained in the Burlington vortex, or, maybe it was talked about the Rock Lake Terror, or the, um, sea serpent, the sea monster that lives at the bottom of Rock Lake. Well, right next to that, only about 2.5 miles, is one of the oldest heritage sites in Wisconsin. That's called Astalon Park. And people would convey to me, what happened to them at Astalon. So just kind of being able to make human connections over these specific places that I put in the book. I think that's been very valuable for giving people an outlet to say, I thought I was crazy, but one time I was driving down Bray Road and I saw this thing, or I was in the Burlington vortex and this happened, or whatever. I think it's been great to hear the feedback and get people's either their validations or just getting something off their chest.
I think the validation thing is a really big deal too. That's
Mhm.
the one thing that I've found through the years that uh, adult clients have said to me, where they said, I had this stuff going on when I was a kid, and I couldn't tell anybody because my parents are going to think I'm nuts, or they're not going to believe me, or whichever. I mean, I think the parental response to some of these stories, because I firmly believe that kids, I mean, we're born with the ability to tune into this stuff, and we've seen
Mhm.
this over and over again through studies for decades. And so, how would you coach parents and tell them, like, how to react to a kid if they're coming to them saying, "Hey, mom and dad, I saw this," and
Yeah.
if parents are scratching their head, going, I don't know what to say. What do they say?"
Wow, that is a really loaded question, because I guess it really depends on the nature of it, where it happened, when it happened, and just kind of, rather than shutting them down and saying, "Oh, that's hocus pocus. That stuff doesn't happen. That's only in the movies." Um, getting them to talk a little bit more about it, and I think just by talking about something that happened, and having a honest and open discussion, can actually disarm a lot of the kids. So I know if my son, if he's afraid of something, will say, "Okay, well, let's go check it out. Let's look in the closet. Let's look under the bed. What did you see? What did you hear? Oh, do you think?" And then we can use a little bit of logic and say, "Oh, that was a low flying plane that wasn't growling, or that was the dog outside," and just kind of, maybe not explaining it away, but just making them a little more empirical. Um, will give them a little bit of bravery, because not everything, we love when supernatural things happen. We love to hear the supernatural stories, but maybe they're not always happening. Not every single case is that of a ghost, or not every light in the sky is a UFO. And just to kind of teach them to be a little more logical, and kind of like, Mike talked about his dad, and just being like, "Okay, we can put some empiricism to this.
Hmm.
We don't want to discount things out of hand and just say, no,
Right.
that's definitely not what it is, but just saying, okay, let's explore this. Let's come
Hmm.
up with what it could be." And then, maybe something continues to happen, or it's something that they could completely not know. Maybe it's like a full body apparition, or
Yeah.
maybe it's a loved one that's passed on that came to say their final goodbye, or to send them a message, validating them and saying, you know what, I've heard of something like that happen. Tell me more about it. That can
Hmm.
a lot of times just take the stigma off, and then you'll ask them like a couple weeks later, and they'll just say, oh yeah, that's something that happened, and then they'll move on. So I think just that by not stigmatizing it, being open, being honest, and not being judgmental about it is probably the best advice I can give for that.
I think it's excellent advice. And I want to just wrap this up with kind of a cool example of exactly what you just said and how important it is. Some dear friends of mine, people listening have heard me talk about a good friend of mine, Alicia, uh, who came with us on a couple of expeditions last year, and her amazing husband and daughter, and her daughter began coming out with us at a relatively early age. I think she was about 15, I guess, at the time. And what's been so interesting to watch with her and been so cool is that here she now is about to graduate high school, and she's going into university and all these crazy things. But what's
Hmm.
really neat is that she, throughout the experiences that she has had with the research that we've been doing and things like that, she has garnered a greater sense, from what I've been told and from what I've observed, of not only calm, a greater sense of herself, um, just the ability to look at the world in a friendlier way,
Hmm.
and to be able to turn around and use techniques that we've learned, that understanding that we create our reality and all of these different things. She has mastered her experience so young, and she uses the techniques in everything she goes into. Everything from getting her driver's license recently, as I say, she's going to be graduating, manifesting her spot at the university, and now she's going into psychology
Hmm.
because of
Of
what
course.
she's of course of what she's learned. I mean, we don't have parapsychology courses in Canada, so the psychology was the next best thing, I think, and whatnot. And she's moving into that so that she can teach this to other people. And I think this is such a prime example of the impact of what this information can actually do for somebody, and especially at such a young age, because I wish I had those tools back then. I mean, man, it would have changed everything. So, Jeff, thank you so much for doing this today. Please tell everybody about Badgerland Legends and the podcast and the book and where they can find you, because I can't recommend you enough.
Thanks so much for having me, Morgan and Mike. Yeah, so Badgerland Legends on Instagram and Facebook. I focus on the people, places, and things that make Wisconsin legendary. And I try to keep it to a post daily, about something you you don't know about a place that you do. Wisconsin Legends podcast is a evergreen project. We have 2 seasons out now. A third may or may not be in the works, so stay tuned for that. The Wisconsin Legends Facebook group is a great place to connect with people. If you're from Wisconsin and you want to hear some interesting things about Wisconsin, check me out there. And Wisconsin Legends for Kids is available on Amazon, KDP Publishing. So get your copy there. Thanks so much for having me.
Please go out and get it, you guys. If you've got kids, this is such a great way to introduce them to this subject matter. So you are always welcome here, Jeff. This has been awesome, and we're well, now we have to have you back because now we have more cases to cover. So that's the way it's going to be.
Sounds great.
All right, and we're back after our conversation with Jeff Finup, and wow, I really appreciate that. His target audience for this book is children, really.
Yeah, it's so important for kids to be able to, I think, experience this world in a way that still entices them to believe in magic in a way, you
Mm-hmm.
know? to be able to realize that there are still so many mysteries in this world that we don't understand, and that you don't have to be afraid of it.
We've said it so many times. It doesn't always
Mhm.
have to be spooky. It doesn't
Mhm.
always have to be creepy and something demonic or something is coming to kill you. It just has to be something we can't explain. That's what's interesting. Let's talk about more of that.
Yeah, and what a great way to introduce kids into this subject matter, because a lot of the greats in the field nowadays, they're getting older, they're looking to pass the torch.
Mhm.
And I think being able to pass the torch to kids that are naturally curious and naturally in tune with non-physical and naturally in tune with wanting to know more, and encouraging that, like you were saying, just to put the brakes on the fear, and be able to turn around and say, look, let's approach the world from that's the standpoint of number one, being humble enough to say we don't know, and number
Yeah.
two, just putting the fear down to be courageous enough to be curious.
I was terrified as a kid of all kinds of different things. I was scared of the dark, but interestingly, my dad, he was really all about, let's investigate this. Let's look at
Yeah.
this stuff. He gave me National Geographic. He sat me in front of science shows. He showed me anthropological things. It was like all this stuff that he put me in front of, which developed my curiosity. And if we had lived in Wisconsin, I'm pretty sure this was one of the kind of books that Dad would have said, here, have a read of this.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's what makes this so fun. And I think, especially for kids maybe that have had experiences already that
Hmm.
have maybe freaked them out a little bit, something's happened that they can't explain. Maybe they've grown up in a haunted home. I
Right.
mean, my experiences happened when I was a kid, and that's what got me so curious about this. I was about 9 years old, and I had a home that, I mean, we were bombarded with activity all the time.
Hmm.
And thankfully, I was able to beat my fear a little bit and become really, really interested. But it wasn't without the guidance of shows like Sightings, for instance. People that
Right.
I now work with, Lloyd Auerbach and Carrie Gaynor, and people
Right.
that I'm friends with. But had they not introduced this to me through different avenues, I'm probably wouldn't have that same excitement about it that I did when I was that age. So I think a book like this it's really, really important to just get kids going in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree.
And for that too, I should also mention to everybody that's listening, there are other books as well that kids can get their
Mm,
hands on and get.
plenty. Yep.
Yeah, there's so many. One of my favorite book series was by Esther and Jerry Hicks, and they were known as the Sarah books, and they're still available. You can go on Amazon probably, and God
Used
knows where else.
bookstores. Yep.
Used bookstores, yeah, and they're a wonderful books to introduce kids to the idea of creating your own reality and parapsychology and all of those things. They're very empowering. Zach Hyman recently wrote a book for anybody that's a sports fan out there. He recently wrote a book called The Magician's Secret. It's phenomenal. It's all about understanding that you have to believe it before you see it. And he talks about the power of this a story, and what we tell ourselves we can create. So there's books out there for kids that can really start to introduce them to this field and this world, and they're amazing.
So if you want to buy Jeff's book, Wisconsin Legends for Kids, you can buy it at Amazon or wherever you go. And you can also listen to Wisconsin Legends podcast with Jeff and his friend Mike Huberty. And they talk about all kinds of really crazy things that happen in Wisconsin. I mean, Ed Gein was from Wisconsin, so,
There is that. For some reason, I don't think that story is going to be in the book. I don't know.
No. It definitely won't be. But it's on Dark Poutine. If you Google that and Dark Poutine, you'll find me talking about that. Anyway, thank you for joining us on this eerie expedition, dear listeners.
And remember, there is no line between the natural and the supernatural. All is consciousness. Until next time, stay curious, friends.
Bye. Supernatural Circumstances is a co-production of Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings and Good Egg Studios. This podcast is part of the Curious Cast podcast network. Theme music by Corey Johnson of Catalyst Records in Edmonton, Alberta. You can learn more about Morgan Knudsen at entityseeker.ca and learn more about me, Mike Browne, and listen to my show, Dark Poutine, at darkpoutine.com. Feel free to email the show at supernaturalcircumstances@gmail.com.